What you're saying rings so true. You can join me in my pissed off corner because this is the problem. A lot of times the victims are female, not always, of course, but who's in power in churches? Men. So if men are in power and females are victims, how does the female voice get heard when there's no way of communicating? And when you do communicate, you're shut down by this patriarchal system that they may not even know or be aware that they're a part of. And when you have this mostly women-run organization that says, hey, we got something to share with you, and there's crickets, hi, we have a problem, a systemic problem in our institution. Because our victims are voiceless and the power structure is maintaining the voicelessness of the victims for an organization that imagines itself to be caretakers of victims and those with poverty.
You are listening to Prey vs. Predator, the podcast. We are thrilled for you to be listening with us today. We are on part 2 with our amazing guest, Carolyn, from Hagar's Voice, an organization that we should all be supporting. Please go listen to the first episode. It gives you some foundational information about Carolyn and also what Hagar's Voice does. We're going to go into a little more detail today. Carolyn, can you just quickly introduce yourself again so our listeners know who you are?
Sure. I'm in my professional life, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I also have a background in spiritual care, and I'm getting trained up for spiritual direction. So that's kind of what I do on the side, so to speak. And then my passion that I love to do is work with Hagar's Voice as a co-director with other co-directors and volunteers, becoming alongside survivors of clergy sexual abuse and, supporting them to advocate for themselves. And we also have an arm of Hagar's Voice that does activism work, and that's around moving the needle on clergy sexual abuse. And really what we want to see happen is a movement. We want to see things change so that it's, there isn't so much space that predators can operate in secrecy and silence. We get it exposed, and that happens by training churches, training staff, training people in churches to know how to look for it. So those are the two things we do: advocacy and activism.
Thank you for that. That's our passion as well. We want to equip the prey of the world to be able to spot predators and to arm their own mental health and physical health and well-being. You are talking about coercive techniques that are being used by this institution, which we call the church or whatever institution, to keep people quiet and silent, the sin of omission. What other ways would you, Carolyn, see how these institutions use coercive techniques? Can you think of other ways that we can maybe discuss a little bit for our listeners? I
do think this would be an opportunity to bring up DARVO. That's Jennifer Freyd's work. She's a psychology researcher, and she has just done an enormous amount to bring information and research means that there's concrete evidence to back it up. And DARVO, I think this is okay to talk about it here. It seems to fit in the next, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So the first step is denial, and we see that the truth of the story is denied. Gaslighting occurs, disbelief, shock, all of this vitriol towards the person who's disclosing. So that's the first tactical move, is denial. Sometimes it's done individually by the predator. Sometimes it's done by the institution supporting the predator. Most often it's done by all of the above. And then even those who might be, known associates, even friends with the prey, they sometimes will have that kind of, I'm not so sure about this. Maybe they're not denying, but they're certainly resisting. And often that sin of omission comes into play there, where they just go silent. And what we know about injustice is, if you're being silent, then you're part of the problem. Then you're actually, in alignment with those who are perpetuating the injustice. So deny, definitely. And again, lots of resources to look into as far as that. Attack. So then the tearing down, the questioning, the disclaiming. If there's any history in the survivor's background, that's questionable, or anything, that they've made mistakes they made in their life before, or just anything. It's going to come out almost like a court case on social media. But even in their friendships, there can be whispers about, well, she had this pattern. This is, she used to go behind closed doors with this pastor. Oh, I always wondered about her level of faith. All of a sudden, there's all this, revisioning history for the person disclosing. And then reverse victim and offender just refers to positioning the person who is disclosing abuse, particularly when it comes to clergy sexual abuse, and seeing them as the problem. We're just going right back to Eve here, which is a very strong narrative in Christian culture, certainly. And obviously women, but I think anyone who is vulnerable to clergy sexual abuse and other forms of emotional and spiritual abuse, they have been conditioned, groomed, trained inside their own identity. There's an imposter syndrome that is operating that, allows them to believe, to buy into, or almost forces them to buy into the narrative that, oh, it's really my fault after all. And so that reversal from them being the ones who are actually the preyed upon to positioning them as, oh, they're the predator, because look at all this trouble they're causing. Look what they're doing to this poor man who has a family and a wife and is doing so much for the kingdom of God. And that's the reversal. And it's not confined certainly to evangelical Christianity and churches and ministry organizations. You'll find this, throughout certainly North America. I think anywhere where there's a system in place with humans in it, you'll find it. But yeah, I just wanted to pop that in there because if you hear that in contrast to, or alongside the story that was just shared, you can kind of see how systemic it is.
Yeah, and you were even saying in our time between our podcast tapings about how this DARVO is used even for not even just the victim or the prey. It's for people who are speaking alongside the prey.
Yes.
DARVO is used to be like, I wish this person would shut up. They're just causing problems. Be quiet. Don't stand alongside this person who's making these claims or allegations because you're causing too much problems.
And somehow, not only the humanity of the survivor, but the humanity of those who ally with them is torn down, right? It's a very dehumanizing experience. And I have to say a shout out to Hagar's voice. I get very emotional as I share this. Some of our volunteers, they're amazing and they're, professionally credible. A lot of them do come out of really significant church training, church leadership, seminary graduates, volunteers, long histories in giving and caring and leading and serving. And, here they try to come and walk alongside people who are suffering. And it's just such the way that they are, experiencing the load of all that, because they usually have their own stories, whether it's clergy sexual abuse or just the load we carry being women in church, or anyone who's living on the margins of the center of power in church because of intersecting aspects of their identity, the load that's carried, and then you just go and try to do this work. Sometimes they're not able to. And, our volunteers are wonderful, our advocates, they have to do all this training to be part of it's beautiful and we need more. And at the same time, we have to grieve. We really have to do our grief work. And we've learned this about us as an organization. It's so hard to stand in that space and grieve with the survivors and grieve with what's going on, while also you're often experiencing the personal consequences from your own story as a survivor.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up grief, because I think even as a person witnessing some of these stories from afar, there is a grief because you kind of go, you might have looked up to somebody or you admire, or they told funny stories and you really kind of engaged with some of the teachings. And, there's so many stories out there in Christendom and evangelical culture, even politically, there's politics, anybody in leadership, you kind of go, oh, yay, they're great.
There's a good one.
There's a good one. Finally, there's a good one. And then it's like, these stories of trauma, abuse, coercion, and they come out and it's so disappointing. And it's hard not to just turn your back on belief or on an institution, and it's finding our way back. And there is a grieving process.
I remember when I was young, there was this saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And yeah, I see it like often in churches, pastors have an unreal amount of power, especially male pastors.
Well, and we have doctrine that supports that.
That's right, yeah.
And we have doctrine that's created around supporting that. And this is the issue, is that as long as we don't have a voice for what is coercive control, what does it look like, how do we identify it, how do we acknowledge it, and how do we support the victims of it over the predators? If we can't get this into our systems, and that's what's so exciting, Carolyn, in my mind about Hagar's Voice, is you guys are actually attempting to penetrate this old boys network, this incredibly patriarchal, misogynistic doctrine of authority, and you're trying to bring awareness, ironically, like a Christ-like awareness to protecting the victims, which is so backwards that you would have to have this small movement and group trying to give voice to the victims from the head of the from Jesus being somebody who supports victims.
Yeah. Oh yeah, as you're speaking, so many things are coming to mind. I'm trying to slow my brain down because it tends to speed up the more passionate I get, but I'm going to take a deep breath, do my own work. I know it's in a church called Tov. I've read it in many other places. I've experienced myself in my own 15-year experience of spiritual abuse and emotional gaslighting. And I really liked the church I was part of. I was very passionate about it. But in the midst of it, I've had to realize, oh, geez, these things are happening to me. Churches put a ton of resourcing into leadership training. Train up our leaders, go to leadership conferences. Like, it's huge. It's a machine, and it's an entire industry. And we have to pay attention to that. This is an industry. We live in a corporate society, capitalism. And so the leadership industry, the amount of pastors who kind of become life coaches, and there's nothing wrong with what we're saying in that sense. It's not bad if you were a pastor and you became a life coach, or you became a leadership trainer, or you became someone who goes and trains corporations. That's not the problem. The imbalance of resources is the problem when it comes to churches actually doing their own work of training people. Trauma-informed care, DARVO. Like, these are just the beginnings of, like, if there's churches out there who haven't done the basics of those kinds of trainings and brought in experts and professionals to help their staff, their leaders, even their congregants. If you don't have a culture that is in emphasizing those types of things and protecting those who are most vulnerable in this day and age, but you look at your budget list and you see all kinds of resources for books and conferences and speakers, and the list goes on, then there's something wrong. And I really encourage boards to go and check that out. Where are your resources going? What kinds of speakers are you bringing? Where are your leaders putting their energy and time and mental focus when it comes to what they're being trained up for? And so many of those leadership trainings come out of a historically patriarchal, white, power-focused business model. And I get really riled up when I think about that, because when, we try to run an event for survivors in Hagar's Voice, we get crickets. We had one brave church in Thunder Bay, grassroots church, give us a huge donation way beyond, like, it was really interesting. It was a real David and Goliath moment. And we all cried in our meeting, because there was churches that we had actually worked with our activism side of things, because we have a whole curriculum that will come into churches to work through. We got nothing. They didn't sponsor people. We sent emails. They didn't donate. They didn't, offer to support us. But this tiny little church was like, oh, we'll help. And they also offered to provide volunteer support on the ground. And it was really interesting because it stood out because it was so disproportional to what is going on out there in evangelicalism and where the resources are going. So yeah, maybe that went a little off topic, but I apologize. But I got a little wound up.
what you're saying rings so true. You can join me in my pissed off corner, because this is the problem. A lot of times the victims are female, not always, of course, but a lot of times the victims are female. But who's in power in churches? Men. So if men are in power and females are victims, how does the female voice get heard when there's no way of communicating? And when you do communicate, you're shut down by this patriarchal system that they may not even know or be aware that they're a part of. And when you have this mostly feminine, mostly women-run organization that says, hey, we got something to share with you, and there's crickets, hi, we have a problem. A systemic problem in our institution, because our victims are voiceless, and the power structure is maintaining the voicelessness of the victims for an organization that imagines itself to be caretakers of victims and those with poverty. Anyways, I would love if you would speak more to that. I would love to hear more about your about what you guys do and what you would like to offer the churches who are crickets right now. We want to challenge those churches to stop being crickets and open to hearing the voice of the victim.
And be advocates.
I remember a quote by Martin Luther King. He says, "It's not the bad people who do bad things that's the most painful. It's when good people see it and say nothing." And we don't want to be those people. I think that's fair. We want to see it and we want to do something. A lot of times we don't know what to do or how to do it or even how to go about that. And I understand you've got some ideas in your organization that you've really thought out about steps that people can take. Can you share with us a little bit about what those steps are and how we can be people who don't say nothing but actually support a victim?
Sure, thanks. One of the things we take really seriously is being intentional and really operating with high integrity. And so for us, these really resonate with our core values. And our core values rotate around trauma-informed principles. And we kind of think of love, which is the willingness to kind of, come alongside in ways that other people need rather than the way we think they need to be loved, what our version of love is versus the version that, serves them well. So there's kind of a lot of definitions there. But as I share these, just picture that overarching all of these is a real humble stance of putting the needs of survivors first while also caring for ourselves. So it's kind of something we hold in tension and attend to, which you can just picture that as a backdrop as I'm sharing. So yeah, as I was preparing for this, I didn't realize we had 10 of them because I was just kind of going through all our materials and kind of thinking about what was important and the different topics that come up and the different things that we weave into our trainings. But I kind of like it. It's nice to have a list of 10, the 10 commandments of supporting survivors of clergy abuse well, according to Hagar's voice. So the first one is, the first three actually, even before you engage as an ally and a supporter, is to be doing your own work. That means individually as well as corporately. Certainly institutions can be doing their own work systemically. And so be doing your own work means that you're on a journey of transformation, whether that's spiritual transformation, emotional transformation, relational, psychological, physical. Whichever areas are most important in any given moment, hopefully all of them kind of dance together and weave together, but be doing your own work to address the things that you need to heal from, to address the things that you notice get stirred up around these topics, just to become a healthier whole person so that you could extend from an overflowing cup rather than serve out of your scarcity. And honestly, I kind of feel like I should have as I point the finger forward, a bunch are pointing back at me because that's one of the hardest things for us to do who do this work of supporting survivors is to remember to care for ourselves, remember to attend to our work, remember to go to our therapy sessions, to do our self-care, to be transforming spiritually, in whatever ways are meaningful to us. So yeah, even before you're engaged, do your own work, especially if that involves your own story of clergy sexual abuse or any form of emotional or spiritual abuse in the church. And please resource for that. There's a lot of resources out there. Seek them out and engage in them.
I think that's really important for, I know that Jill has talked about telling our stories. And as people who are prey, who've been victimized or whatever, survivors, however you want to label us, we need to tell our stories. So even if we're in these situations where we want to be an ally, we have to own our own stories in the process. And I hear that's what you're saying, and we've talked about that before, but it's not about just having an empathetic ear to somebody telling their story. It's us owning our own stories and looking at them for what they are.
Yeah. Thanks. Number 2 is be informed and educate yourself. And I think, again, this applies individually. This also applies corporately to systems and institutions, certainly churches and other ministry organizations. So being trauma informed. We've also talked about DARVO. I'm realizing as I continue to evolve in my learning journey, those are kind of like almost should be standard practice. They're like the bare minimum. And a lot of people and organizations out there don't even have an awareness of what those are. So definitely access resources to understand spiritual abuse. I really appreciate Mennonite Central Committee. They have a really good website for that. And there's several others. We have sister organizations. It might be helpful just to go to the resource page at Hagar's Voice, because I'm not going to spend time here listing all those. But yeah, get informed and do the work of educating yourself and invest resources in that. That's part of the justice piece of all this, is this takes resources. And being a good steward of those resources in support of survivors and through educating yourself is worth it. Take your time, take your energy, take your resources. Churches should be using their training time. They should be using their funds to train the people working in their midst. There's all kinds of ways our resources should be actively educating and informing people about clergy sexual abuse. And if your church is not doing that, start asking the leaders why. Instead of, committing that sin of omission, actually engage and use your voice to question, why isn't this, being raised as a topic when we're seeing it all around us in church culture.
Can you repeat what the sin of omission is again?
Oh, yes. That's just being an inactive bystander. Mm-hmm. So when, something is disclosed online or, particularly in Ontario, it's not a very big place. And I think the entire church across Canada evangelical church isn't that big when you start kind of learning about these stories. But sin of omission just refers to silence. When we, don't engage and actively work and put our resources towards informing, protecting, getting educated and informed, even providing funds, providing resources. If it is something that's come out in our own community, the sin of omission means that I've just stayed silent. And that quote you read at the beginning really speaks to that.
Yeah, when the good people say nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. The third one is actively working for change. What are you doing in your role, whatever it is? Maybe you do have influence and a certain amount of power in your church or ministry organization. What are you doing to, use that to move the needle on clergy sexual abuse? Translating your role and your level of influence into action. That's justice work, but it's also spiritual work. And certainly I would again speak to Jesus as a perfect model of this. If you are a follower of his, you will notice that he didn't just speak all the time. He actively came alongside. And if you look at the postures of his body throughout the stories about him, he is moving in ways that actually actively work for change and demonstrate change in what he's doing, not only in what he's saying and what's being recorded about what he's saying and in how he's relating to people. Hopefully people can be inspired to follow that model. It's a pretty good model.
It's a great model.
I think about Jesus too in terms of how provocative he was to the powers that be.
Yeah.
And he was not silent and did not cower his voice. He actually and actively was in front of them speaking his truth and using his voice to do so.
Yeah. And I want to make a note about that because, those first three are just about preparing to be an ally and a supporter. And I want to note that there is suffering involved here.
Yeah.
It's like if you have to, take stock of, and that's why we start with doing your own work of healing. There's going to be suffering. There's a reason you guys are keeping yourselves anonymous. There is an element where we are choosing to walk, a path of, I guess, again, using spiritual language, crucifixion, right? There will be suffering involved when you choose to go against the powers that be, especially the ones that are working so actively in the darkness and trying to keep all this a secret, trying to expose that. There's going to be a cost, just like there is in all justice movements and change movements. So, yeah, just being really aware of that. And the more aware you of that going in, the better off you'll be and the more able you'll be to support those who are suffering well.
Even while you're talking, I think of it in terms of being the squeaky wheel. And I think sometimes being a squeaky wheel is hard because everything around you wants you to shut up. Just shut up about the squeaks. We're okay with the squeaks. And you're like, no, I'm going to keep squeaking until something is done. And I know, or just stop, just shut up. And I think that's what you're speaking to, is that sometimes it's easier to shut up because the whole institution wants you to shut up. But no. And it's Hagar's voice for a good reason.
I had a friend say to me a couple of weeks ago, so you're trying to take down the church? Like, no.
Trying to rebuild it the way that we're asked to.
Anyway, we digress.
But even the social justice element, like I think of even in my own personal life, there's elements in my job and whatever, I'm being the squeaky wheel, not for my own benefit. Because if it was my own benefit, I would shut up because it would be easier. But I'm doing it for the benefit of somebody else. And it's hard.
Yeah.
And it does have a cost.
Yeah. Well, I know it's hard. There's so much to say, but I will note that in terms of justice, we also want to remember that, the people usually doing this work are those who have intersecting identities that keep them in the margins, but also makes them really vulnerable. So certainly me as a white female, cisgendered, I do this from a certain place and I have vulnerabilities, but I don't have near the number of vulnerabilities that my Indigenous friends and partners have, or my Black female friends, never mind my Black transgendered friends. And so we want to make sure that we're honoring that this taking care of yourself also relates to all of the aspects of your identity. And that's a minefield when it comes to the evangelical church. Not everywhere, but certainly historically, and things are changing, but they're very slow to change. So I just think it's really important to remember that this is just one piece of the puzzle for a lot of people in their identity. And we'd be really remiss if we didn't honor that. And I really want to emphasize that I don't know what it's like to carry even more parts of my identity that are, oppressed and pushed to the margins, and to carry the burden of that on top of everything else, while also knowing that brings a lot of beauty, and that often that's where the leadership and the richness of doing things differently comes from.
Amen.
Keep going,
so number
Carolyn.
4, believe them and posture yourself accordingly. That's the number one thing. The effort to discredit survivors is tactical. It is very intentional. And to just believe them is one thing. And then to voice that belief, to voice that support, to, kind of go beyond, especially in this era of social media, but also personally. So put your voice out there as much as you can in terms of support, but also in the stories you're hearing in your home groups, in your small groups, in the foyer at church, or as people are hanging out as they're getting ready to, walk in. All these places and spaces, wherever you are, don't stay silent and express belief and posture yourself according to that. And remember, and we use the word decolonization, but what we really want to do is make sure that we're believing their story, not our version of their story. And certainly in Canada, we have a really bad history of wanting to make it our story that we're proliferating, not the story and their story. So watch out for that. Watch out for the way that you're sharing on someone's story, and even remembering to use their version and their words and refer back to them. Don't speak for them, but, speak alongside them and, lift up the things that they are saying and the claims they are making.
That's huge.
So Number 5, resist the compulsion to theodicize. I have a real beef about that, but that's my own background.
Can you explain what that means for people?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
Theodicizing occurs when people want to vindicate God. They want to vindicate God's narrative, vindicate that God's going to come through in the end, that God's ultimately all for good. And it's kind of like they're little warriors that, we can't make God look bad. And it's like, no, but we sure can, shout out when the humans are looking really bad who claim to follow God. And we kind of conflate those, right? So theodicies might look like even little phrases like, oh, this will make you stronger, oh, something good will come of this. It's all those redemption narratives. And, you can believe that, and we can have a faith in, something may come from this in the end, but that is not the narrative that a survivor, especially, early in their ownership of their own story, even before they've disclosed if they choose to do so, I had a loved one who went through cancer treatment for quite some time. They're a very vulnerable person. And it got really hard to keep having people tell me, well, I'll just say it. I don't often share the story because it's a whole other part of my journey, but it was my son. He was 7 years old when he went through cancer treatment. I'm not meaning to be shocking. I'm just using this as the example of theodicizing. And so many times I'd be watching him suffer in this tiny little body that was being emaciated. And people would come out with this, like, he's a superhero, put a cloak on him. And there was this whole like weird thing. And I'm sitting there going like, no, he's a little kid who's really hurting and he shouldn't have to go through this. And can you just like lament with us for a moment before you plant your flag for cancer survivorship and raise your funds? And I'm being extreme and hyperbolic. I want to say I love all my friends who supported us. And sometimes the weight of that theodicizing message is so heavy for those who are actually in the trenches doing the work. And I could get really, use some vernaculars here, but like they don't have energy or time to think about validating God or vindicating God. They're just hurting and suffering and miserable. And they just need you to see that and sit with them in it. So no theodicizing, no telling people that, they're going to be better, their faith will be stronger if they just pray enough, or that you'll pray for them, or like, those aren't bad things. They're just not what someone needs to hear when they're going through some of the most tragic moments of their life. So I'm a little passionate about that one. And I see it happen to survivors. I've been to actual events for survivors where that happens at the front of the room.
Yeah,
So
it was like, I think that's such a powerful thing, because so often we want to bypass the suffering and get
spiritual bypassing is what it's called.
That's what I was thinking about that too.
So that idea where instead of being present and with you and witnessing the pain and the suffering and feeling seen and heard and understood.
The seen is a big thing. They're not seeing what's in front of them. They're
not acknowledging it.
Yeah.
And so you feel like I love that analogy, like the plant the flag. It's like, I don't want to plant a flag.
Mm-hmm. It's too uncomfortable.
Like I'm in pain. Like, I can tell you what to do with your flag, but I'm hurting and I don't need the flag. I need you to just witness that I'm not okay, that, we are not okay.
See me.
I think that's such a meaningful point. And I think from survivors' perspective, that is probably the most powerful thing you can offer somebody in suffering is witnessing them and getting with them in that.
Yeah.
Not making it better.
And training yourself to be comfortable with it, which again, you can do that beforehand.
It's hard.
It is.
It's the awkwardness of life and the difficulty, and maybe not knowing what to say. And that's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. And sometimes that's something you can either train yourself in to know what to say. I had to practice that sometimes in situations I was in. And then also, messing up, right? And actually saying that, like, I don't even know what to say. I really want to be here with you in this. That's enough sometimes. And if that's all you have, and that's the safest thing you can say that instead of something that could be worse.
I love that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, and that plant the flag again, I just want to acknowledge like we're a colonized, many of us, most of us are colonized people, and we just can't help planting our flags. We've been trained to do so. We've been rewarded for doing so, and we have to decolonize that. There is no flag planting on someone else's horrific story. So yeah. 6, empower them, keeping consent at the forefront. And that whole, like, know what consent is, understand it. That's part of the training. What does it mean to actually restore consent to someone? What's heartbreaking with survivors is that they don't even realize that they have been trained to not know they should give consent in so many situations. Consent for their story to be repeated, consent for how their body is impacted, consent for who's in their space, consent for what they have to attend or don't have to attend, consent for who they're on, connected to on social media. There's just so many areas where, people, and unfortunately, I do think we are super unhealthy with this in churches. And again, I'm for the church. I church planted for 15 plus years, actually closer to 20 years. And that's a lot there from my story. But one thing that I grieve is the way I did not honor people's consent in like private spaces. So there's public spaces. That's kind of like the bus driver, the taxi driver. There's social spaces, the foyer of a church, a hangout time at my house. Then there's private spaces, which is me and a few close friends, maybe my family members, my husband, a few people I feel really safe with. And then there's intimacy. So public, social, private, intimate. We F those up in church all the time. And we do this with them. We just don't get it. Public is public. Private, intimate things don't belong in public. They certainly don't belong at the front of a church. Intimate is intimate. And we don't make intimate spaces feel weirdly like they're social or public. And we don't have social people in our social spheres, in our intimate spaces. And unfortunately, generally speaking, I know there are people who are better at this than others, but yeah, evangelical Christendom is not great at honoring boundaries and not great at honoring those kinds of oversharing, sharing things that are inappropriate, sharing someone else's story, getting someone to go up to the front and pressuring them to share their intimate story, all this kind
laying
of yucky
on
stuff.
Of hands, even when you're
talking. I will restrain myself from saying more about that, but it's a big one.
But even while you're talking, I'm thinking of like laying on of hands and things like that. It's like, maybe they didn't have permission to put your hands on them. Have to ask. But that wasn't how I was raised. You just, and even I think of, I don't know, just spiritual stories that were expected. I remember even as a 14-year-old person going to like on a missions trip, and I had to give a testimony, and I hated it because I had no testimony, to be honest, frankly. Well, my testimony wasn't that interesting, to be honest. But now I think about it, I'm like, there was no consent to that. The expectation was there. So I thank you. I thank you for bringing up the idea of consent, especially when we're talking about victims in much more profound ways than I'm even describing. But even in lesser profound, we need to have consent.
Just a question, would something like prophecy be in like, sometimes people will come up like, I feel like you've got an issue with your mother and or I feel like like you've got a problem and like that.
You need to be more open to God or something, whatever.
Yeah, I wonder if we would include
that's another episode.
That is
but I just never thought of that as like you
consent.
just brought that up in my mind, so I just had that wonder. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Keep going.
Yeah, it's conflated with theodicizing, right? The whole prophecy thing, right? So, and people have told me I have the gift of prophecy, and I tend to believe it, but I also know it's not consensual to prophesy on someone when they're
right.
So that's just a side note, because I know that people listening to this who are going to start thinking like, oh, I bet you this woman doesn't have very strong faith at all. And I'm like, it's interesting. I get accused of that all the time. But if other people who know me in other parts of my life, I actually am deeply passionate about spiritual formation. And so it's really interesting when I get just the way that my identity pieces get pigeonholed. And so that theodicizing, sometimes when I go on about that, people can be like, oh, she must not be really, hold God highly. But we have to believe two things can be true. I can believe we shouldn't theodicize and believe that, people can have a really strong faith, even if they don't theodicize. So we just need to be more complex humans. I want to also mention with the empowering is that we have to follow the person's timeline and pacing. Could say a lot about that, but I will especially just emphasize that again, we'll want to like follow our own pace or have our ideas about what they need or how it should go or when they should do certain things, whether or not they should take legal action, whether or not they should even disclose. We will have all these things. Our parts are going to want to come into the room and play around with that. And we really have to pull back to our center, to our soul, and recognize that is not for us to determine. That's what empowering is all about. So just keep that stuff, dignity, autonomy, slowing down, being patient. These are all things that we train our a wonderful person who I texted her during the break because I wanted to have her consent to share her name, but Lila Weber is the lead of our support arm of Hagar's Voice. And she has developed a lot of training around this and does an excellent job of modeling it. And then also helping those who are volunteers with us as advocates to really make sure they're doing these things. And when we don't, we apologize and try to do better. Number 7, I basically just had at the minimum engaged through a trauma-informed lens. And certainly there are the 6 principles of trauma, which you can Google. I won't spend time here. They should be very well known by now, but allowing ourselves to operate through a trauma-informed lens just keeps everyone safe, but particularly those who are suffering from and recovering from trauma and really living in the symptoms. That I feel like that's just basic stuff right there. So I won't spend too much time on it. Number 8, refer to professionals. We really take this seriously. That's partly why we call ourselves a movement, is we don't want to be a destination. We don't want to become the experts in, what survivors need to do or legal stuff they need to do, or even therapeutically. We want to be sort of a throughway. We want to support them on their journey to those professionals that they need support from, or equip them while they're waiting to access or until they're ready to access those professional supports. But in the meantime, you can be certainly resourcing for helping them receive those. But yeah, don't go beyond your scope. Know what you know and leave, or like talk about what you know and leave the rest. And that's so important because this is risky stuff. Trauma is a serious thing, and certainly the effects of it can show up in different ways. And when people push past what they're actually safe with and what they actually know about, it can really put survivors in a really compromised and actually unsafe place. So refer to professionals as much as you can, and really be aware of those resources in your area, in your church, just wherever you are, know what the resources are and how to access them. Number 9, stay engaged as long as needed and as long as it's healthy for you. And we just emphasize here, permission yourself to either access a circle of support. Hopefully you have one, but you should have your own circle of support, which should be, beyond the survivor circle of support. Mm-hmm. So if you picture, kind of circles beside each other, those who are doing support work, especially if you're really involved deeply in allyship, especially if things have gone public, I hope you can, in whatever way, online or in person or through your families, however it's safe. Certainly Hagar's Voice community tries to be a circle of support for you as you work as part of a circle of support for a survivor. Last one, don't put the burden on survivors to educate you or anyone else, especially your church. They may choose to do that. Usually they don't do that for a long time. I know, oh gosh, the name's escaping me. It's the person who disclosed about Ravi Zacharias. Oh, it kind of grieves me. But I recently was listening to her share online. Oh, darn it. And as she shared, she just really spoke to this, that, she needed almost 10 years to be ready to kind of go to start like educating and sharing what she was learning with others. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're burdening those who are most vulnerable to educate the rest of us. So that's just good practice. That's and it's very, honoring of of justice. Educate yourselves because you can and you have the resources to do that. And don't position survivors to be the ones who have to teach or train. Or if they do that, great. But they shouldn't be put in a position where that's an expectation on them or a burden on them. Sometimes we can even alleviate that burden. I've had conversations with people and I've been like, that's a lot. Are you sure? And they'll realize in the midst of that of like, oh, geez, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that interview. I don't want to meet with that person. I'll be like, yeah, so don't. And certainly we have to pay attention to that in Hagar's voice because partly because we're trained, if we are women, we've been trained to overextend and we've been trained to just go beyond what's healthy and okay for us. But I think anyone who's been involved in the evangelical church, it's kind of part of the culture, right? To live in scarcity. So to honor our boundaries, to honor the limits of what we can do, especially when it comes to helping in the form of educating or sharing or, doing what we can. Sometimes it's hard to know that actually I can't do that. I shouldn't do that. So let them say no. And better yet, don't even ask them to engage in that, especially in a church setting, especially if it's the setting that they were actually abused in, which, believe it or not, actually does happen. Go share with the board. They could learn so much from you. It's like, no, you are actually abusing them and re-traumatizing them. So could say a lot more about that, but I wanted to kind of get through these quickly. So I'll let it end there. That's the list.
Carolyn, this has been so good.
Thank you so much for all this information.
I think we are forever changed. Thank you to Hagar's Voice. You guys are
lovely to talk to, so thanks so much.
So if folks want to get in contact with Hagar's Voice, the best way is website?
Yeah, go to the website, hagarsvoice.com, and then there's also info@hagarsvoice.com.
How about, would you want anything, resources for yourself? I want to offer that and honor that. If people want to find more information about you, you can also say no.
Yeah, just go. Yeah, I'll rather send that Hagar's Voice.
Okay, excellent. I wanted to offer that and honor that part of yourself.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. This has been the gift to me is just being with you lovely people today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn, for being with us.
And thank you, our listeners. Please reach out to us. We want to hear from you. If you want to email us, we have our website or our email on our social media. So please go to our YouTube channel, go to our Instagram. Please follow us, give us a thumbs up. We also have a Patreon, so we'd love your support.
And we have a new store.
Yes, we have a store with merch. So please check us out. We can only do this with your support. So we really love it when you reach out to us or even just give us a thumbs up. We'll take that too. So have a great day. And thank you so much, Carolyn, for coming and sharing Hagar's Voice. And please check out what they do and how they do and support them, donate, whatever you have to offer. I know that they would appreciate it. And just check them. And if you need their resources, or please reach out to them because they are an organization or a movement that we need to support, and also they're there to support us if we need it.
Thanks,
so
Carolyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.